Are Christians today obligated to keep the Sabbath? As we look around the religious world today, we see many people claiming that we are required to follow the Sabbath today, that as Christians we are under the Sabbath law. But is that the case whenever we turn to the pages of the Scripture? If we go back into the Bible and we find the command given to observe the Sabbath, we find in Exodus chapter 20 the picture of Mount Sinai. Now we have to remember at this point we are talking about the Hebrew people who have been delivered away from Egyptian bondage out of slavery, and they've made their way to Mount Sinai to receive the commandments of God. And these are things they are going to be required to do if they want to continue to serve God and be blessed by God. Among those 10 commandments, we find commandment number 4, which is to keep the Sabbath day holy. Let's consider Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. The reasoning behind them observing the Sabbath day is given and stated specifically there in verse number 11. Consider it again. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. As we look there in verse number 11, consider why did God choose the seventh day to be the one that would be holy, the one that they would have to follow and observe to rest upon? Well, we see there in verse number 11 that he creates this command because that is the day that God rested upon. Now, why exactly did God rest on the Sabbath day? Was it because God needed to rest? Was it because he needed to recuperate? No. He rested on the Sabbath day because his work was finished. And so ultimately we are looking at the shadow of what is to come in the New Testament. Now, today we consider the question, are we under the Sabbath law today? Are we obligated to follow the Sabbath law today? Whenever we consider the commandment given here in Exodus chapter 20 and consider the context behind it, we understand that this was given in the Mosaic covenant. It was given to the Hebrew people, especially for them. We can find in Deuteronomy chapter 5 verses 2 and 3 this stated, "The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. The Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day." Now consider who Moses is talking to there in Deuteronomy chapter 5. As we consider once again the Hebrew people, you'll notice specifically that Moses points out that this was not something that was given to their fathers, and that's talking about the generations previous to them. It was something given specifically there to the Hebrew people to watch and observe. If you go down a little bit later and consider verse number 15, it says, "And remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord thy God brought thee out thence through a mighty hand and by a stretched out arm. Therefore the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day." The command, therefore, cannot be kept by Christians today. We were not held in bondage by the Egyptians. We were not delivered out of bondage by the hand of God. The command is specifically given there to the Hebrew people. Whenever we turn to the pages of the New Testament and consider the new law, what does it say about us observing and keeping the Sabbath? Consider with me Colossians chapter 2. Verses 14 and 15 read, "Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. And having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it." As we consider when the old Mosaic law ended, we consider that it ran up all the way to the cross. Now, if we go back and consider the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 and verse number 17, we see that Jesus did not come to destroy the law, but rather he came to fulfill it. And that's exactly what he did on the cross. Now that the old law is nailed to his cross, it is done away with. It is made old. Colossians 2:16 and 17 reads, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day, or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ." We must further declare that Sunday is not the Christian Sabbath. Many today have made the claim that that is the case, but the Bible tells us otherwise. We are never told to rest on Sunday specifically as they were told under the Sabbath command, but rather Sunday as the first day of the week we are commanded to worship, considering Acts chapter 20 and verse number 7. Now with that in mind, what exactly was the shadow that the Sabbath day represented? It certainly has a lot of shadows of things that were to come, but it's shadowing ultimately the finale, the rest that is expected at the end of the Christian's life if they have observed the commands of Christ and followed them and obeyed them. Consider with me Hebrews chapter 4 verses 3 and 4. For we which have believed do enter into rest, as he said, As I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, And God did rest the seventh day from all his works. The author here ties together the entering of the promised land with the ultimate rest that is desired by Christians. And we notice that as the Israelites entered into the promised land, as we find back there in Deuteronomy chapter 5, as they're preparing to enter into the promised land, the rest was not given whenever they entered into the land, but that ultimate rest is desired by all at the completion of one's life. Consider verses 9 through 11 of Hebrews chapter 4. There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. For he that is entered into his rest, he also has ceased from his own works, as God did from his. Let us labor therefore to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. Our ultimate hope of rest is not found in any day of the week. Our ultimate hope of rest is found at the completion of this life if we have obeyed the gospel, followed after Christ, and lived a life of obedience to him. Let us therefore look forward to that ultimate rest, that eternal rest in heaven with God. Thank you for your time.